It's July 10th, 2026, and overnight, this war stopped being a fight between two countries and became something far more dangerous. For weeks, the shape of this conflict was simple to describe, even if it was terrifying to watch. It was America versus Iran, strikes and counterstrikes centered on one narrow stretch of water, the Strait of Hormuz, the channel that carries a fifth of the world's oil. The United States hit Iranian military sites. Iran harassed shipping and fired back at American targets. Back and forth, dangerous, but contained to two players. On the night of July 9th, that changed. Iran did something it had not done at this scale before. In a single night, it fired ballistic missiles and drones at four separate countries: Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and Jordan. Not at American warships in the Gulf, not at American soil, at its neighbors, at Arab states, at the very countries sitting between Iran and any possible path out of this war. Four countries, in one night. Now, here's the idea I want you to hold on to for the next 15 minutes, because it's the key that unlocks everything else. When a country under sustained attack starts firing at the nations around it, instead of the one actually hitting it, that is not usually a display of strength. In the history of these confrontations, it tends to signal something very different. Something closer to desperation than to dominance. And there's a second layer that almost no coverage is connecting to the first. All of this, the four-country barrage, happened on the very same day Iran was burying its supreme leader. A leadership transition and a regional escalation, unfolding in the same 24 hours. Hold both of those in your head. By the end of this video, you'll see why together they may make this the single most dangerous phase of the entire war. I'm not going to hand you either side's press release. Both Washington's framing and Tehran's need pressure apply to them, and I'll show you exactly where. Some of what's being reported tonight is confirmed, some of it is contested, and I'll be careful to tell you which is which, because on a story moving this fast, that discipline is the whole job. If you want the version that follows the logic instead of the noise, subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel exist. Now, let's walk through the night, slowly and in order. Let's start by establishing what is actually confirmed, because in a story like this, the difference between confirmed and claimed is everything. Here's the sequence. Over 2 consecutive nights, the United States struck Iranian military targets, around 80 on the first night, roughly 90 on the second. That's according to U.S. Central Command itself in its own public statements. CENTCOM framed the operation the same way it has throughout, as an effort to degrade Iran's ability to threaten freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz after Iranian attacks on commercial ships. President Trump, posting online, called the strikes retribution for the bombing of those ships and warned it would get much worse if it happened again. That's the American side of the ledger, on the record. Then Iran answered, but look carefully at where it aimed, because the targets tell the real story. According to Iran's Revolutionary Guard, and confirmed by the countries that were hit, Iran struck at U.S.-linked bases across the region. In Kuwait, the Arif Jan base and Ali al-Salem air base. In Bahrain, Bushehr, which is the home of the U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet, its primary naval headquarters in the Gulf, and Sheikh Issa Air Base. It targeted a site in Qatar, and it launched ballistic missiles at a military base in Jordan. Now here's the detail that, for me, tells the whole story. Iran fired 10 ballistic missiles at Jordan's Azraq military base. Jordan's armed forces said they intercepted 8 of them after air raid sirens sounded across the country. Falling debris, but no casualties reported there. Kuwait's defense ministry said at least 1 person was injured. Qatar briefly raised its security threat level, then lowered it shortly after. Bahrain reported sirens sounding at least 3 times over the night. Step back and picture what that actually looks like on a map. Iranian missiles arcing out of Iran in multiple directions at once, crossing into the airspace of 4 neighboring states, several of them Arab governments that had spent this entire war trying to stay out of the direct line of fire. Missiles intercepted over Jordanian cities, sirens over Bahrain, injuries in Kuwait. This is no longer a duel across the Strait of Hormuz. This is a regional event. 4 countries, not America, its neighbors. Say that back to yourself, because the entire meaning of this night lives in that one distinction. Now to the moment that made the whole world hold its breath. And the moment where I most need you to slow down with me, because this is exactly the kind of story that gets twisted in the telling. Bushehr. First, what Bushehr is. It's a coastal province in southern Iran, and it's home to Iran's only civilian nuclear power plant, a facility built with Russian technology and staffed continuously by Russian technical personnel. For years, that Russian presence functioned as an unspoken shield. The logic was simple. No one would risk striking near a nuclear plant full of Russian technicians because the consequences of Russian casualties are impossible to fully control. It was, in effect, a form of insurance. So here's what was reported on Thursday. According to Iranian state media, quoting a local official in Bushehr province, projectiles struck the perimeter around the plant, specifically a nearby military facility on the outskirts of the city and a fishing pier to the south. Residents of a town about 12 miles from the plant reported hearing several explosions. Now, this is where careful matters more than dramatic. 3 things you need to hold at once. First, this account comes from an Iranian official. The United States, through CENTCOM, had actually announced hours earlier that it had ended its strikes, and it did not confirm carrying out this particular one. In fact, a U.S. official told reporters the American military was not conducting strikes in Iran at that time. So who carried out this specific strike is genuinely contested. Second, every serious outlet reporting this is consistent on one point. The strikes hit the area around the plant, and the reactor itself was not damaged. Third, this same perimeter had already been struck earlier in the war, months ago, and also without damage to the plant itself. So the responsible way to state this, the way the actual evidence supports, is this. The area near Iran's only nuclear plant was struck again. The plant itself appears intact, and exactly who fired this specific strike is disputed. That is a much quieter sentence than "they bombed a nuclear plant," but it's the true one. And I'd rather give you the true, quieter version than the dramatic, false one, because that's the entire point of this channel. And here's the thing, even the careful, accurate version is alarming enough on its own. You do not need to exaggerate it. Any strike near a nuclear facility, regardless of who fired it, narrows the margin for an accident that no one on any side actually wants. It's the kind of event where a small miscalculation could produce a consequence measured not in headlines, but in decades. That's why the restraint in how we describe it isn't just about accuracy. It's about not adding panic to a situation that is already, genuinely, on a knife's edge. Now here's the piece that reframes everything you just heard, and I've seen almost no coverage connect it to the rest. Because to understand why Iran might fire at 4 neighbors in one night, you have to understand who is, and isn't, in charge inside Iran right now. All of this happened on the day Iran was burying its supreme leader. Let me give you the full weight of that. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the man who ruled Iran for decades, the ultimate authority in the entire system, was killed at the very start of this war in a U.S.-Israeli strike back on February 28th. For months, his death has hung over this conflict. And on this exact day, July 9th, the week-long funeral procession reached its conclusion, with his burial in the city of Mashhad, his home city. His son, Mojtaba Khamenei, has now stepped into the role of supreme leader. Sit with what that combination means. On the same day, a state funeral for the fallen leader of the revolution, a brand new supreme leader whose grip on power is not yet fully consolidated, and the most intense military escalation of the entire war, all at once. A leadership transition, a national moment of mourning, and a 4-country missile barrage compressed into a single 24-hour window. Now connect that to the strikes on the neighbors. Underneath the supreme leader sits the Revolutionary Guard, the IRGC, which has its own parallel command structure, its own institutional culture, and a long history of acting on its own initiative. In a moment like this, a new leader still finding his footing, the whole system under enormous pressure, communications degraded by weeks of strikes. Who exactly is authorizing each individual missile launch? Is it a single coherent strategy signed off at the top? Or is it commanders down the chain, acting on instinct, on institutional pride, on the need to be seen responding, during the most chaotic week the system has faced in a generation? And here is the honest, uncomfortable core of it. I can't tell you which for certain, and neither can anyone outside that system. But look at the behavior itself. Firing at 4 neighbors, at bases you cannot seriously damage, drawing 4 more governments into fury against you on the day you're burying your leader, that is not the calm, calculated move of an actor in full control. The pattern of lashing out at what you can reach, precisely because you cannot reach what's actually hurting you, is rarely the behavior of strength. It is far more often the behavior of a system under pressure, reacting faster than it's thinking. And a system reacting faster than it's thinking, with ballistic missiles, during a leadership transition, is the single most dangerous thing in this entire story. So let's step all the way back and be completely honest about both what this means and what it doesn't. Because the temptation in a story like this is to flatten it into a simple narrative, and reality is never that clean. First, what this does not mean. It does not mean Iran is finished, or that this is some tidy story of a collapsing regime. That would be a fairy tale, and I don't deal in those. 14 people were killed and dozens more injured over these 2 days, according to Iran's own health ministry, including a firefighter at an airport and civilians. That is real human cost, on real streets, not an abstraction on a map. Iran still possesses a large missile inventory. It still has drones. It still sits astride the Strait of Hormuz, and it still has the power to disrupt the world's most important oil corridor, which is exactly why oil prices have been climbing on the mere fear of it. Anyone telling you this is over or one-sided is selling you something. But here's what it does mean, and this is the part that matters most. By firing on Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and Jordan, Iran did not weaken the United States. Not by a single aircraft. What it did instead was hand 4 Arab governments a direct, personal reason to turn against it. 4 nations Iran has spent decades trying to influence, court, and intimidate into staying neutral. It attacked the exact neighbors that any future ceasefire, any diplomatic off-ramp would depend on. In one night, Iran made its own isolation deeper. That is not the arithmetic of a country that's winning. It's the arithmetic of a country that can't reach the one actually hurting it. So it strikes the ones it can, and pays for it in the only currency it can't afford to lose: the goodwill of its own region. And that is precisely what makes this the most dangerous phase of the entire war. Because the real risk over the next few days is not a planned, deliberate, calculated escalation. That, at least, would be rational, and rational actors can be reasoned with, bargained with, deterred. The real risk is a miscalculation. A single missile, fired by a mid-level commander trying to demonstrate resolve during a chaotic leadership transition, on degraded communications, acting on institutional pride rather than strategic logic, that lands somewhere it was never meant to. On a neighbor's apartment block instead of a military base. On a target that crosses a threshold nobody's strategic planners actually intended to cross. And that single event pulling the entire region into a war that not one of its leaders says they want. That's the danger, not the missiles that are already planned. The decision that hasn't been made yet, made under pressure, in the dark, by someone whose name the outside world will never know. So the question I'd leave you with isn't who's winning. That word means less every day this grinds on. The question is quieter and much harder. When a cornered power starts firing at its neighbors instead of its enemy, and no one, not even inside its own system, is fully certain who's giving the orders, how does anyone find the brakes in time? That's the question the next few days are going to answer. And it's being decided right now, in rooms we can't see, by people operating on instinct and pressure rather than strategy. This is Professor John. I'll see you in the next one.